Jerry Palus stood at the edge of the dance floor at Liberty Grove and Hall on Chicago's southwest side, watching the blonde woman in the white dress move through the crowd. It was January 1939, and something about her caught his attention immediately. She seemed alone, ethereal almost, her white gown glowing under the ballroom lights. He worked up the courage to ask her to dance. She accepted. They spent hours together that night, spinning across the floor as the band played. She told him her name was Mary and that she lived on South Damen Avenue. But when Jerry took her hand, he noticed something strange. Her skin was ice cold, like she'd just walked in from a blizzard without a coat. When they kissed at the end of the night, her lips felt the same way, frozen. Jerry offered to drive her home and Mary accepted, directing him northeast along Archer Avenue. They drove in near silence until they reached Resurrection Cemetery in Justice, Illinois. Mary suddenly spoke. "I must leave you now," she said. "You cannot follow me." Before Jerry could respond, she stepped out of the car and walked toward the cemetery gates. Jerry blinked, and she was gone. Vanished. Not walked away, not hidden behind something. Simply ceased to exist in front of his eyes. The next morning, Jerry couldn't shake what he'd witnessed. He drove to the address Mary had given him on South Damen Avenue and knocked on the door. An older woman answered, and when Jerry described the young blonde he'd danced with the night before, the woman's face went pale. "That was my daughter," she said quietly. "But she's been dead for 5 years." But before we dive into what happened after Jerry's encounter, if you love paranormal mysteries about unexplained sightings and ghostly encounters, then you're in the right place, because that's exactly what we cover here. And I upload new stories 3 to 4 times every week. So if that interests you, please gently tap the like button and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future uploads. All right, let's get into today's story, which takes place along Archer Avenue in Chicago, Illinois, beginning in the 1930s. The legend of Resurrection Mary actually predates Jerry Palus's 1939 encounter, though his story became the most famous and well-documented sighting. The tale begins sometime in the late 1920s or early 1930s with a young woman who'd spent an evening dancing at the O. Henry Ballroom, later renamed the Willowbrook Ballroom in Willow Springs. According to the story passed down through generations of Chicago residents, Mary had gotten into an argument with her boyfriend or date at the dance hall. Angry and upset, she stormed out into the frigid Chicago night wearing nothing but her white party dress and dancing shoes. She started walking northeast along Archer Avenue, likely trying to make her way home. She never made it. Somewhere between the ballroom and Resurrection Cemetery, about 3.5 miles away, a car struck her. The driver didn't stop. Mary died on the roadside, alone in the dark. When her parents found her body, they were devastated. They buried their daughter in Resurrection Cemetery, dressed in the beautiful white gown she'd worn to the dance, along with her matching dancing shoes. The hit-and-run driver was never found. Keep that detail in mind, because it becomes important later. By the mid-1930s, just a few years after the accident, strange reports began circulating among men who drove along Archer Avenue late at night. They described picking up a young hitchhiker, always a blonde woman in her early 20s, always wearing a white dress. She would be standing on the roadside between the Willowbrook Ballroom and Resurrection Cemetery, thumb out, looking for a ride. The men who stopped described her as eerily beautiful, with pale skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair styled in the fashion of the era. She was quiet, sometimes carrying a small clutch purse, often wearing a thin shawl over her shoulders. She would climb into the car and give directions, always heading northeast along Archer Avenue. But as the car approached Resurrection Cemetery, something impossible would happen. The woman would either ask the driver to stop, then walk toward the cemetery gates and vanish, or she would simply disappear from the moving vehicle without ever opening the door. Richard Crowe, a Chicago historian and folklorist who became known as the city's first full-time ghost hunter, spent decades collecting accounts of Resurrection Mary sightings. By the 1990s, he'd documented over 36 substantiated reports, spanning from the 30s to the present day. The consistency of these accounts is what made Resurrection Mary different from typical urban legends. These weren't friends of friends or vague secondhand stories. These were first-hand witnesses, many of whom had no knowledge of the legend before their encounter, describing the same woman, the same white dress, the same vanishing act at the cemetery gates. Jerry Palus's 1939 encounter was different because it was the most intimate and detailed. Unlike the roadside pickup stories, Jerry had spent an entire evening with Mary. They danced, talked, kissed. He'd felt her frozen hands and lips. When he described his experience to Richard Crowe decades later, and again in a 1986 videotaped interview that aired on Unsolved Mysteries in 1994, he remained adamant about what he'd seen. Jerry wasn't some attention seeker or ghost enthusiast. He was a typical Chicago working guy who happened to dance with someone he later came to believe was a ghost. Throughout the decades that followed, the sightings continued. In 1973, Resurrection Mary allegedly showed up at Harlow's Nightclub on Cicero Avenue. The night manager, Bob Main, described a woman with blonde hair and big curls, an extremely pale complexion, and an old-fashioned dress that looked like a wedding gown left in the sun. She sat alone by the dance floor and wouldn't speak to anyone. She danced by herself, doing pirouette-type movements. Main said she seemed to look through people, and up close, it appeared she was bleeding from the eye. That same year, a cab driver came into Chet's Melody Lounge, located directly across from Resurrection Cemetery, asking about a young woman who'd left his cab without paying her fare. He said he'd picked her up near the cemetery, and she'd vanished before he could collect. No one at the bar had seen her. Here's where it gets stranger. In January 1979, just before the infamous blizzard of '79 dumped over 20 inches of snow on Chicago, another cab driver named Ralph picked up a young woman on Archer Avenue. Ralph had just dropped off a passenger way out in Palus Heights and was heading back toward the Tri-State Tollway. The woman flagged him down, climbed into the back seat, and they drove in silence for a couple of miles. Suddenly, she jumped up with a start and yelled, "Here! Here!" Ralph hit the brakes hard. He looked around but didn't see any houses or buildings. "Where?" he asked. The woman pointed across the road to her left at a small abandoned shack. When Ralph turned to look at the shack, then turned back, she was gone. The car door never opened. Ralph, who was 52 years old, a veteran, a father, and a Little League baseball coach, swore to columnist Bill Geist of the Suburban Trib that he wasn't crazy and that the door absolutely never opened. But the most famous incident occurred in August 1976, when a passing motorist reported seeing a young woman in a white gown standing inside Resurrection Cemetery after closing, gripping the wrought iron bars of the gate as if she were trying to get out. The motorist called the police. When officers arrived, the woman was gone, but they found something disturbing. 2 of the bars on the cemetery gate were bent, and in the metal were what appeared to be handprints. The iron seemingly scorched or melted where fingers had gripped it. The marks looked like they'd been burned into the metal by something impossibly hot. Cemetery officials later claimed a truck had damaged the fence and that there was no paranormal explanation, but photographs of the bent bars with the handprint impressions became legendary in paranormal circles. The cemetery eventually removed and replaced that section of the fence, but not before it became one of the most talked-about pieces of physical evidence in American ghost lore. In 1980, Claire Rudnicki and her husband Mark were driving down Archer Avenue when they spotted a young woman in a white gown walking along the roadside near Resurrection Cemetery. But this wasn't a normal person. The woman appeared translucent, partially see-through, with a white aura or glow surrounding her body. Terrified but intrigued, Claire and Mark turned the car around to get a better look. By the time they completed the U-turn, the woman had vanished completely. Then, in 1989, Janet Kalal was driving near the cemetery with a friend when a woman in a white gown suddenly jumped in front of her car. Janet didn't have time to brake. She hit the woman directly, but there was no impact, no sound, no body. The woman simply vanished on contact. Researchers have spent decades trying to identify the real Mary behind the legend. Two names come up most often. Mary Bregovi, a 21-year-old Polish-American woman, was killed in a car accident in downtown Chicago's Loop in March 1934. She's buried in Resurrection Cemetery, and she did live on Dahmen Avenue, matching the address Jerry Palus's Mary gave him. But there are problems with this identification. Mary Bregovi had short dark hair, not blonde. She died in the Loop, nowhere near Archer Avenue or the Ballroom, and the timeline doesn't quite work with Jerry's story of her mother saying she'd been dead for 5 years in 1939. The other candidate is Anna Maria Norkus, a 12-year-old daughter of Polish immigrants who died in a car accident in July 1927. Anna went by the nickname Mary and loved to dance. But she was a child, and every witness describes Resurrection Mary as a young woman in her late teens or early 20s. Anna also isn't buried in Resurrection Cemetery, but rather at St. Casimir Cemetery across town. The truth is, we may never know who Resurrection Mary really was, or if she was any specific person at all. The Vanishing Hitchhiker is a type of folklore that exists in cultures worldwide, dating back centuries. There's even a 400-year-old Swedish manuscript that describes a similar ghostly woman appearing to travelers. But what makes Resurrection Mary different is the sheer number of first-hand accounts from credible witnesses over nearly a century, all describing the same woman in the same white dress, vanishing at the same cemetery. Resurrection. Mary remains Chicago's most famous ghost and one of America's most enduring paranormal legends. Whether you believe she's the restless spirit of a young woman killed on her way home from a dance, or simply a powerful urban legend that's captured imaginations for generations, the sightings along Archer Avenue continue to fascinate believers and skeptics alike. If you found this story as intriguing as I did, I've got another classic paranormal case you need to see. Click the video on your screen right now about the most documented haunting in American history. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories like this. Thanks for watching. Until next time, see ya.